Hi, everybody. This week's topic is myths of the apocalypse. That vast, dramatic, catastrophic ending that comes to the world or to the universe. The end of days, as such. There are many different myths of the apocalypse throughout the various cultures that we have in the world. But before we begin to examine them and their characteristics, I think it's important to ask ourselves the question, why is it that we are so preoccupied with how the world may come to an end, or with the end of days, or the end of the universe as such? We're very preoccupied with creation myths as well. We're interested in knowing how it is we came into existence, why it is we are in the world, what our relationships are to other people, what our relationships as human beings are to other aspects of the universe or to the universe as a whole. And creation myths are really central to our identity. They also reveal to us the structure of the universe as it evolves, as it comes into existence. So it makes sense to consider myths of the apocalypse as the opposite of this. They are, in essence, the taking apart of the universe, the destructuring of the world as a whole. And they reveal to us, and this is why I mentioned creation myths as well, they reveal to us that life-death cycle that is inevitable for humankind. We know when we are born that at some point or another we will die. We just don't know how or when. Our preoccupation with this as individuals is paralleled in our preoccupation with this as cultures. So just as we don't know how we will die or when we will die, but we know that it's inevitable, we imagine that the universe will die, the world will end, and that is inevitable too. So we see a kind of mirror here between our own individual experience and our larger cultural experience, and we seek to explain it. And we do this in many ways, including myth. And we know that stories of the apocalypse or apocalyptic themes, motifs, images are present all over the place in popular culture. We have TV shows, we have films, we have video games that predict and project visions of what may happen at the end of days. And we also have these sorts of images, symbols, motifs, themes appearing in myth. So let's take a look at definitions to start with, okay? An apocalypse is a revelation. From the Greek apocalypsis, or a revealing, a prophetic vision, a vision of the catastrophe of the world. So it's interesting that the Greek root of this is actually a revealing. A revealing, it would seem, of the inevitability of the end of days. So we know that it's going to happen, we're just not sure how. And at the end of days, that is what will be revealed to us. This is the Greek apocalypsis. The study of the end of things is called eschatology, from Greek eschatos, meaning last. So these stories are called eschatological, which is to say that they explain the last things or the end. Now, there are many characteristics of tales of the apocalypse, myths of the apocalypse that we can come to, and there's a lot of variety amongst them. So I'll just give you some characteristics or some things that we might see throughout the myths that we examine. So we often see the destruction of the old universe And this may create space for a new or better world, or it may mark a return to chaos, depending on the culture and the myth. If there is a new world, then the catastrophe will completely destroy it, and then the new world will emerge and be renewed. The emphasis in tales of the apocalypse or myths of the apocalypse is usually on the end of the current order of things. So as I mentioned, creation myths provide us with the structure of the universe as each culture imagines it. And myths of the apocalypse indicate a kind of problem with that structure that then can only be resolved through a catastrophe. Sometimes this will appear in the disintegration of the world's society. So, for example, our moral fortitude, there will be moral degradation, there will be crime, an increase in lying, in stealing. But in addition to that, degradation of the Earth's environment as well. These can signal the approach of an apocalypse. Some would argue we are currently in a time like this, but I'll get to that, okay? A decline in morality then is often associated with the end of time, as is a decline in the environmental state of the world. In addition to that, the final days are often described as a period of confusion, violence, lawlessness, warfare. Okay, this is our moral degradation as such. But it can also be a time of natural disasters, and this is our environmental degradation, droughts, storms, volcanic eruptions, earthquakes and famine, suffering, disease, those kinds of things. Sometimes a sign might appear from the heavens, the sun and moon might grow dim, stars might fall to the earth. Sometimes monsters and demons might emerge. Sometimes there's a day of judgment. All these things are possible in myths of the apocalypse. Through these myths, human beings express a sense that the highest powers of the universe must intervene to put a failure to all humanity. This idea fits very much with the Day of Judgment. And we will see that this concept is unique or connected to, shall I say, those cultures that usually have a Day of Judgment in their apocalyptic visions or myths. In some myths, the human experience is not as emphasized. So it's not so much that humans have failed, it's just that the entire structure of the universe is not working out and it needs to be reset. So the reset button needs to be hit. This can be seen as some kind of ritual cleansing, an expression of the human fascination with death and the resurrection process. So again, we have that life and death cycle occurring. And sometimes the righteous survive. The thing about myths of the apocalypse is that they are heavy on symbol and fantasy. And many of their elements border on the fantastic. This is really the stuff of movies. They are visionary, they are prophetic, they often contain strange beasts, wonderful creatures, resurrection of the dead, and they are very closely related to the flood archetype. So there may be a deluge, as I mentioned before, natural disasters and such, yes. And as I mentioned, this kind of imagery, this apocalyptic imagery, is very present in reality today. And we have very real world concerns or current day concerns that seem to mirror some apocalyptic visions, like global warming, climate change that is connected to forest fires, for example, tidal waves, typhoons, an increase in hurricanes. Yes, all of these things are seen as sort of pre-apocalyptic aspects or elements that are signaling to us that the world is coming to an end. So there are a few key stories that we can connect to these ideas or these characteristics of myths of the apocalypse. One of the most well-known stories of the apocalypse, of course, is Ragnarok from the Norse tradition. Not the movie, not the Hollywood movie, but the myth as it appears to us in written form. The myth of Ragnarok is recorded in Snorri Sturluson's Prose Edda, which is about the Common Era, about 1220. It shows up, BCE. Or sorry, CE, Common Era. That would be AD to some, okay? The story of Ragnarok is one that is heavily violent and dramatic. It is a story of war, of deception, of dishonor. As I say, very dramatic, yes. Fate is very important to the Norse tradition. So the events leading up to Ragnarok are seen as preordained. This is one of the key aspects of Norse culture, is that the gods are aware of natural omens that are signaling the beginning of the end. They know what's going to happen from the beginning. And so Norse gods live with the knowledge that they are doomed. As I say, one of the key aspects of Norse mythology is that everyone knows that the end is coming. It is inevitable. And the omens are present to signal it, and everyone knows this as well. Okay? The gods also know what must happen when Heimdall, the trumpeter's horn, summons them to meet evil monsters and giants on the battlefield. They know it's coming. So Ragnarok itself doesn't happen in isolation. There are a series of events that lead up to it. The key event that sets the stage is when Loki, the trickster god, causes the death of Balder, the most virtuous and beloved of the gods. And then after this, the world becomes increasingly wicked. After this, we have 3 years of warfare that follow. We have 3 years of winter that follow. And then we have a series of events that lead to the eventual battle on the plain of Vigrid. Vigrid? I'm not an expert on the Norse language. We have some key events happening. Hati, the wolf that pursues the sun, manages to catch it and swallow it. And a second wolf's skull catches the moon. And then Surt, the giant who rules the fiery realm of Muspelheim, sends flames into the sky that cause the stars to fall to earth. All of these events signal the coming of the end. And when one morning the golden cock that lives in the home of the gods hears his crowing answered by the black cock that roosts in the underworld called Hell, the last day of the world begins. So we have a series of multiple events that lead up to this final battle. In the battle, Odin, who we are most familiar with, dies when he is swallowed by Fenrir the wolf, for example. Thor kills the world serpent, but is then killed by its venom in return. Heimdall, the trumpeter, and Loki, they kill each other. And the fire giant Surt sets the world on fire. So we have a vastly violent demonstration of a battle that signals the end of days. This brings the end to the world of the gods. But what's important in Norse mythology here is that this does not bring an end to time. Okay, so it's an end of an era or a period that will not be repeated. After the end of Ragnarok, the sun gives birth to a daughter, and a new sun, moon, and stars begin to shine. A new rainbow appears to take the place of Bifrost. Odin's sons survive, as do 2 humans, and they survive by drinking the dew of the world tree, Yggdrasil, and then go on to produce a new race of human beings. So, as I mentioned before, in the Norse tradition, Ragnarok will never be repeated. It happens once, it's the end of an age, and then it will not happen again. But we have this devastation, this catastrophic battle, which leads to the end of that period, and then a new one is created. There are many details of Ragnarok that I have skipped here. Norse mythology is very well known for its detail. There are lots of names. This is it in essence. So we can contrast this concept of Ragnarok and this huge battle, this huge catastrophic battle, and this this huge catastrophic battle and the end of an age. We can contrast this with the Indian tradition. We do have a similar concept in a cycle of ages, but in the Indian tradition, this cycle of ages will be repeated again and again and again. So whereas in Norse mythology, we see Ragnarok happening once and then ending and then a new era beginning, in Indian mythology, we have an endless cycle. This is called the Great Dissolution. So we have a cycle of destruction and regeneration. In Eastern views, and particularly in the Indian view of the apocalypse, less emphasis is on human failings and more is on the rhythm of the universe. So in the Hindu tradition, creation and the apocalypse repeat themselves again and again and again. So this is not to say that humans have done something terrible. It's simply to say that the structure of the universe, as I mentioned before, isn't working, and it needs to be reorganized through a catastrophic event. In the Indian tradition, there are a series of eras or ages that lead to Kali Yuga, the last and shortest age. In this age, we see elements that are similar to other stories of the apocalypse. So we see warfare, natural disasters, moral degradation. At the end of the cycle, is one day in the life of Vishnu, one of the primary gods in the Indian Trimurti. Vishnu destroys the cosmos in one day and recreates it by the night. In the endless cycle of birth, death, and regeneration, the universe is recreated by the end of the night, and Vishnu awakens in the form of Brahma. And then we start anew. This is referred to as the Great Dissolution. It involves a series of natural disasters happening over the one day with Vishnu, including drought, fire, flood, and wind. Okay, so we see many characteristics that are similar to Ragnarok, but some that are a little bit different. We don't necessarily have a key battle here, but we do have a huge emphasis on natural elements and natural disasters. In the Indian tradition, the cycle will continue and continue and continue. And in the Norse tradition, once Ragnarok is finished, it's done for good. Okay. In other cultures, including Asian, Mesoamerican, and Native American traditions, the world is not recreated after it is destroyed. So in both Ragnarok and particularly in the Hindu tradition, as we see, the destruction brings about a kind of regeneration. But in many mythical traditions or cultural traditions, this is not true. The world simply ends. In Mongolian myths, for example, the world is destroyed after the mountains turn to dust. And then Erlik Khan, king of the underworld, seeks revenge for an injustice he suffered at the time of creation. So again, you can see how the myths of creation and myths of the apocalypse are very closely connected. Erlik Khan emerges from the sea with 9 iron warriors on horses on the day of doom. Even the gods cannot stop the bloodshed from happening as Erlik Khan's wrath journeys through the space. Eventually, the earth is destroyed by flames. And that's the end of days. In the Aztec tradition, the 5th world is the last one, and it is destroyed by an earthquake. Sometimes, connected to stories of the apocalypse, we see that human beings have developed ways to avoid the end of days. And the Aztec tradition is a good example of this. If it is the case that the world is ending and not regenerating, not coming back, then we want to do everything that we can to put it off, to save ourselves from the end of days. In the Aztec tradition, the strategy is, or was, sacrifice. Human sacrifice was necessary, it was seen, to prolong the age of the 5th world. The ritual shedding of blood would keep the sun in motion, and then when the sun stopped, the earthquake or the apocalypse would occur. So, it's best, is it not, to continue the sacrifices to shed blood so that the sun will keep moving to put off the apocalypse. So we have stories of the apocalypse in which a new world is created once. We have stories of the apocalypse that lead to a life-death cycle, destruction and regeneration. We have stories of the apocalypse that lead to the complete end of time. And then our last kind of story is an apocalypse or a myth of the apocalypse that marks the end of time and the beginning of eternity. These are the stories that are usually accompanied by a day of judgment. They link the destruction of the world with the end of time itself and eternal life or immortality that can follow. In these stories, there is a disintegration of the social order usually and end of moral responsibility, as we saw in the other stories of the apocalypse that I've mentioned. Moral degradation and social degradation, as well as environmental degradation, are common before the apocalypse. So a day of reckoning or a day of judgment is required. In these kinds of stories, humanity is usually the cause. Sometimes there's a mighty battle, which is followed by the raising of the dead on the day of judgment. Good triumphs over evil, and the old corrupt world is replaced by a new order, but the new order is eternal, sometimes divine. We can see this kind of story of the apocalypse in the Zoroastrian, the Islamic, and the Christian traditions. They adhere to this type or this style. A battle between the powers of good and evil ensues. There are usually omens that signal the last days or the end of the world. And then there is a final day of judgment. The wicked are condemned to a hell forever as punishment for evil, and the righteous spend their days in paradise. There is a literary archetype which has been created or acknowledged around this idea, and that is of Armageddon. The term is derived from the Hebrew Har Megiddo, which is the famous battlefield of ancient Israel in the biblical books of Judges and Kings. In the book of Revelation, for example, Armageddon becomes the symbolic battlefield where good and evil must finally fight it out at the time of the Last Judgment. The Christian view of the apocalypse is related to the Persian Zoroastrian Day of Judgment. And again, we want to think carefully about our geographically where these myths come from or where they have been located. Yes, they're all connected in that Middle Eastern area. So it fits that one would be derived from the other, or that they may share some characteristics. In the Persian or the Zoroastrian Day of Judgment, forces of light confront those of darkness, and the dead arise to be judged. So again, similar motifs here. In the end, in this Western view, more Western view, even though it originates in the Middle East, we consider it to be a more Western view, as many religious traditions, particularly the Abrahamic religions, have evolved out of these traditions. We see the end of things and the final establishment of the kingdom of God. So the world that is recreated after the apocalypse is one of eternity. Yes? So these are just some examples of the different types of stories of the apocalypse that we might come to, and also the ways in which different cultures can imagine the end of days. Does the world get recreated, or is a complete and final and total end? Or are we moving through a kind of cycle in which there is a process of destruction and regeneration?